Solidarity, a bond of unity or agreement united around a common goal or against a common enemy, such as the unifying principle that defines the labour movement. Unity, oneness, the state or fact of being one undivided entity. Agreement, harmony. Solidarity and unity. From one direction, people of colour or BAME solidarity, under the banner of the supposed sameness of our experiences under British white supremacy. From the other, working class solidarity, both from the long history of labour movements, especially in places like the Caribbean, and also the fact that black people of all ethnicities are among the poorest in Britain and are often concentrated in traditionally working class areas and occupations. At this point, black support for the Labour Party is taken as a given. I've covered that quite a few times now in various videos. And as the trade unions have been getting more attention now than they have since the Thatcher days, so too have conversations about the importance of involvement from black people. What's interesting about all of this is that black people, other people of colour, and the white working class all have intertwined histories going back centuries. That alone should give us enough shared ground to be getting on with. Interestingly though, a lot of that shared history goes unacknowledged, undiscussed, and can even be seen as actively taboo, divisive even. Divide, to split or separate into two or more parts. Conquer, to defeat in combat, to subjugate, to acquire by force of arms, win in war, to become a ruler of, to subjugate. While England had been conquering its nearest neighbours one way or another since the 12th century, in 1497 Tudor King Henry VII set his sights further afield and told John Cabot, quote, "Go and subdue and occupy and possess any land he discovered." So please go out and colonise for me, babes, and go and get yourself something nice. That was basically what he said. Nearly a century later, the Imperial vision began to come together for England when they formally established their first overseas territory, which they imaginatively named Newfoundland. One thing about colonisers is they're rubbish at naming countries. The next few centuries saw the establishment of the largest empire the world has ever seen, achieved by untold amounts of theft, butchery, displacement, and lies. To the famous self-aggrandizing cliche, "the sun never sets on the empire," glorifying its vastness, trade unionist Ernest Jones added "the blood never dried" as a sobering reminder of how it all came to be. Divide and rule is a phrase associated with the empire for a reason. Division was an integral part of its survival. The tactic goes as far back as Philip of Macedon 2,000 years ago, maybe even further, and is described in detail in Machiavelli's famous 16th century works, Art of War. Seeing themselves as the spiritual heirs of the Roman Empire, through employing divide and rule tactics across most of the empire, the British gained ground by exploiting existing differences, both hostile and non-hostile, between groups, as well as creating intermediary classes who were often, but not always, made up of indigenous people. British Empire historian Ronald Robinson and his collaborative theory of imperialism basically described how the level of colonization depended on the extent of resistance or collaboration from indigenous people. So for example, he compared the formal establishment of a colony in India where there had been indigenous collaboration with the British with China and Japan where there had been no indigenous collaborators, so the British were only really able to install informal forms. Robinson's theory also described the flexibility and adaptability in the British approach. They often flexed depending on local conditions, basically. Then you have sociologist George Simmel and his theory of the triad of imperialism, which described how third parties benefited from the conflict of the two other parties. So the third party would deliberately sow conflict in order to gain dominance and distract forces united against it, to the point where they would then end up turning on each other instead, while the third party was able to dominate and they weren't in a position to fight against them because they were weakened by their division. This was particularly the case in areas that were ruled by indirect rule. Okay, so let's examine how divide and rule played out in all its manifestations, what solidarity looked like, and whether any of this has any bearing on the present day. So what did solidarity along class lines look like in the empire? Well, for one, the white working class certainly weren't faring very well, especially in light of industrialization, which came at great physical, social, and environmental cost to them. The rigid class system, which I've talked about numerous times, had them at the very bottom where they were overwhelmingly left for life. However, in the empire, there was racial hierarchy, which placed white people, Europeans, at the very top. Throughout the world, there awaited various opportunities for genuine social mobility via means completely unavailable in Britain. We see this very clearly in the 18th century Caribbean. In post-Highland clearance Scotland, whereby clan leaders transitioned to a model more in line with that of the aristocratic landed gentry in England, also repurposing large expanses of Scottish land, many lower class clan members were displaced. Some clan elites ended up owning plantations and enslaved people in the Caribbean, and with them, they took lower class clan members. Another way lower class Scottish and Irish people ended up out there was via indentured servitude, or through punishment, being exiled out there. For this group of people, and for the lower class clan members that I just mentioned, a lot of them ended up working as overseers on the Caribbean plantations. As low as life expectancy was for white people out in the Caribbean, if they did manage to stick it out, the lower classes could even go on to own slaves of their own. And yes, this includes ex-indentured servants and ex-prisoners. This is part of the reason why 25% of Jamaica's population can claim Irish ancestry. Many more ended up in America, both pre- and post-independence from Britain, and some of their descendants even ended up founding the Ku Klux Klan. So, while they were the supposed lowest of the low in white society, they still had a position higher than the black African. The imperial model of racial violence, of which the role of overseer played a crucial part, was perfected on the Caribbean plantation and replicated across the empire. Due to the imperial legal system making it essentially impossible for Europeans to be prosecuted for violence against Africans or other non-white people in general, white people acted with impunity regardless of what their social class was. Colonial Justice in British India by Elizabeth Kolsky is a great book if you want to read more about the model of violence and the justice system in the empire. Okay, so we've well and truly established the racial hierarchy that the white working class were able to benefit from, but what about imperial class consciousness and its model of global mass exploitation under capitalism? Well, actually, in the 18th and 19th century, you had Robert Wedderburn, who I've talked about before, who was even more radical and had no connections whatsoever to respectability or the elite classes. His politics were abolitionist, anti-clerical and anti-establishment, and he associated with working class grassroots movements who saw solidarity in their oppression under imperialism. He openly supported violent slave revolts in his native Jamaica and other parts of the West Indies, with uprisings increasing in places like Barbados and modern-day Guyana. Wedderburn had very close ties with the labour movements in London, who did see a common imperial struggle for what it was, but ultimately, a combination of many factors, including media manipulation, soured relations between the labour movements and Wedderburn, with many becoming actively anti-abolitionist, feeling that those matters were a foreign distraction from theirs. I wonder why that feels familiar. Fast forward a little to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and we're in Australia and New Zealand now, where many British miners had relocated en masse to take advantage of new mining opportunities as the mining industry boomed. Conditions were poor, and the risk of death very high as greedy industrialists pushed relentlessly for greater productivity and profits, prompting workers to become militantly anti-capitalist and anti-liberal. At the same time, these greedy mine owners were expanding capacity by using cheap and sometimes even indentured labour from Africans and Asians. This all, against a backdrop of rapid advancements in technology, gave way to nationalistic and racial protectionism among white workers, sensing this all as a threat to their livelihoods and their colonial social mobility. This all ended up tying their trade unionism to racial exclusion. Eventually, this came to a head with the creation of the White Australia policy, coming in just after the Australian colonies unified to create a federation in 1901. This policy included laws which took voting rights away from black Aboriginal Australians, as well as imposing severe restrictions on immigration, and wasn't completely abolished until the 1970s. Meanwhile, a steady flow of movement, both from Australasia and directly from Britain, introduced an influx of British miners to South Africa.
The largest and most profitable deposits of gold are found in the Transvaal, which lies between the natural boundaries of the Vaal and Limpopo rivers. For thousands of years, the gold lay undisturbed, some of it exposed, until in 1886, a wandering prospector almost stumbled on the outcrops, and so the world learned that there was gold on the Rand.
The unions they formed were particularly nationalistic and racially exclusive, commandeering entire cuts of the labour supply for themselves early on. Sometimes you even saw regional exclusivity, as was the case with the Cornish community of miners. It was these groups that eventually pushed for the creation of apartheid, a period of institutionalized and hierarchical racial oppression towards non-European and black people in South Africa and present-day Namibia, which lasted from post-World War II until 1994. So sometimes, in the present day, you get confronted with the old, our ancestors had no idea, or They had no idea what was going on outside of Britain. They were kept in the dark. They had no idea what was going on in the empire. And while there's no one answer to such statements, because they're already a bit too simplistic in their positioning to be addressed without some rearranging first anyway, it's also literally just false. In fact, the British Labour Party campaigned on home turf for the British international working class cause, and some communities, like the Cornish, kept more up to date with things going on abroad than at home. There was even a massive demonstration in the early 20th century where 500,000 people left their houses to go and gather in Hyde Park as a display of solidarity for the white workers of South Africa. It was the largest demo of its kind at the time, and is something that British trade unions still don't really talk about or acknowledge. Don't forget that word. I also want to highlight the fact that the global working class didn't just interact with each other in lands far away. Of course they didn't. They also interacted on British turf. The Coloured Seamen's Union was founded in Cardiff, and in response to the failure for the established union to take action against the Docks Colour Bar, its founding members comprised of Africans, West Indians, Malays and Arabs. That's a good example of POC solidarity, actually. I'm jumping ahead. But anyway, back to this. And across the empire, many people engaged in industrial action. In fact, in many cases, such action was inextricably linked to anti-imperialism and fights for independence. Despite all of this, however, British organisations generally did not welcome them. TUC leadership were against the introduction of anti-discrimination laws in the workplace, despite the fact that the rank and file were supportive, making the usual noises about foreigners and threats to jobs. Even in the 1950s and 60s, this rhetoric was already played out. But to be honest with you, while I've given all these examples of exclusion, there were also a lot of instances of solidarity. So for example, the Bristol bus boycott, while that was in response to the actions and decisions made by, again, union leaders and the bus company's management, the whole city came out in support of the black strikers of all races and mostly working class people. You've also got the life and works of Sylvia Pankhurst, from a famous family of political radicals who spent her whole life fighting against imperialism and fascism, to the extent where she fell out with her own mother Emmeline and sister Christabel, who were both very much pro-empire. Pankhurst's socialist newspaper, The Draftnought, attracted collaborators from across the Pan-African world as they were drawn to its explicitly anti-racist stance. Pankhurst also campaigned the UK government to act with regards to the rise of fascism in Europe, as well as for them to respond when the Italians occupied Ethiopia, the latter of which placed her in high esteem with black activists and Pan-Africanists worldwide as they watched the situation in Ethiopia unfold. Alright, so she wasn't working class, but she definitely worked with and brought together a lot of working class people of all races. Then you have the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, or CARD, which was founded in 1964 after a visit from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which was arranged by Trinidadian activist Marianne Glean, who was also a founding member of CARD. This visit was attended by various groups of all races, including the Southall Indian Workers Association, the British Caribbean Association, and the Council of African Workers. CARD subsequently lobbied for the introduction of race relations law, and when operational, again, had members of all races. Outside of the UK, you had the Afro-Asian Writers' Conferences, which took place between 1958 and 1979, the first of which was held in Soviet Uzbekistan and had a 90-year-old W.E.B. Du Bois in attendance. Inspired by an earlier event in Indonesia, they used these conferences to denounce imperialism, and during its time, hundreds of writers from both continents were able to share their works as well as have political discussions, with a few even going on to become politically influential in their respective nations. Going back further, in the period immediately after emancipation, all the way up until the early 20th century, the British introduced many indentured labourers from Asia, especially India, to work on the plantations that had previously used slave labour. Controversial from its beginnings, you had African and Indian alike fight against the use of indentured servitude, with Indians dealing with similar working conditions to the enslaved Africans. Africans in turn disagreed with the way Indians were policed and imprisoned, and fought back against the quote backward-looking tendency of landed capital to extract surplus through legal coercion reminiscent of feudalism, seeing this as coming from the European desire to control people. It was during this period that the first working class organisations such as friendly societies were formed in the Caribbean. These organisations provided services like healthcare to recently freed African communities, and later expanded their support to include Indians. Race relations figures in Guyana included Reverend H.V. Bronkhurst, who was of Indian and Dutch parentage, Reverend H.J. Shirley, a radical English preacher with a majority African congregation, and Joseph Ruhamon, the Indian editor of the People newspaper, a pro-Indian paper which hosted support from both Africans and Indians alike. Bechu, a notorious Indian agitator and ex-indentured labourer, actively fought against the arrival of new Indians because he knew that indentured labour undercut African labour and that the British exploited newcomers' naivety. Actually, these last examples double up of displays of POC Imperial solidarity as well, and I feel like we've now come to a point in this where I want to analyse a term that was designed to encapsulate the concept but is also very, very controversial and can often cause offence. And this term, of course, is political blackness. The concept of political blackness has been used as a way of labelling those who experience structural and institutional discrimination in the UK based on the colour of their skin, and this is specifically meant to mean people of African descent and people of Asian descent.
Here in Brick Lane, the centre of the Bengali community in the East End, attacks on Asians have been common.
Approximately about 150 or 200 like these youths, all these skinheads, They swearing, shouting and throw these stones, break my all windows. And all of a sudden one is coming here, I break my teeth in here. There's the brick. Now we are frightened every Sunday,
Now, much of the criticism directed against police this year is quite unjustified. Sort of the political axe-grinding type of criticism that we don't care, that we're not trying. We're professionals, of course we're trying. It's a matter of pride to us. In the end of the day, we shall get this right. We learn from our mistakes, and we have, of course, made them, but we shall get it right in the long run.
For many Asians, confidence in the police has been shaken by the events of 1978.
What the youths are experiencing is that if there is a meeting or demonstration of the Bengali people, say numbering 30 or 40 people, the police comes to know about that. But few weeks before, when about 200 National Front people marched and smashed everything in Brick Lane, and we just wonder how come the police didn't know about that.
The policeman he has the right to stop me. He has the right to search me if he really wants to, because if I don't give him that right, he'll take me to the police station. But like I said, it's no good you abiding by the law. He's going to approach you as the person who's upholding the law. And he's going to blatantly lie to you and carry you off or say whatever he wants to say. And then you see, if a public person is found to be lying at court, you do know what they do to him. When a policeman is found to be making absolute perjury in court, it is nothing. And if he cannot abide by the law, and we abide by the law, and he breaks the law, and then he lies when he's in the place of the law, then there is no justice.
You've been acquitted of the charge which essentially began the whole incident. What would you have expected from those officers after their evidence in court and after you now know you've been acquitted?
I can't expect nothing from the officers because they're not human. I've found that out already, so I expect nothing from them. I expect something from the system that makes me respect the law, that tells me I must abide by the law. I can't expect nothing from them. They didn't even wait to hear the verdict because they were so guilty. They walked out, there wasn't none of them there to hear the verdict because they knew they were lying from beginning to end.
More broadly, it serves as a reminder of global and colonial dynamics, the white colonizing exploiter and the non-white or black colonised and exploited. Think the global south. If you've ever read anything by Walter Rodney, you'll be familiar with this dynamic that I'm describing. Inspired by the Black Power movement, the term political blackness served as a form of symbolic unity and anti-racist solidarity through the similarities of colonial experiences intersecting with their non-whiteness, and had its heyday between the 1960s and the 1980s. You can see remnants of this today actually, such as the Southall Black Sisters, which is actually a South Asian women's organisation founded after an anti-fascist activist Blair Peach was killed in 1979 after being struck by a police officer at an anti-Nazi demo in Southall. Prior to the 70s, the main label given to both black people and Asian people was coloured, and politically black somewhat replaced it. It's always had its limitations, both practical and theoretical, in how it flattens the vast range of experiences that it's meant to represent down to one, simply not being white. And it's also the more politically minded ancestor of BAME, which is Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic, I've talked about that before, which has many of the same problems. Also, there were always black people and Asian people who never subscribed to the term, and in the 80s, attitudes shifted as people started to look at things more by a specific ethnic group. Funnily enough though, this period also saw a move away from anti-establishment attitudes and towards one of pursuing inclusion. On the back of the Scarman report published in 1981, there were huge engagement campaigns to get ethnic minorities, Black African heritage people especially, to join the police. Roles traditionally performed by activists became jobs you could apply for with your local authority. This gradual shift wasn't welcomed by everyone, and many radical Black activists were wary both of the establishment and particularly of the Labour Party, with figures like CLR James being openly critical of initiatives like the GLC's Challenging Racism in London conference. While those falling under the politically Black umbrella were inherently divided, the divide that arose during the 1980s was sped up by the government, as activist groups were now pitted against each other for jobs, funding and local authority grants. However, this era also did open things up to include people other than older men in leadership. Women, for example, were fed up of getting ignored or relegated to background duties within the British Black Panther movement, for example. Just see the founding of OWAD or look into the stories of Stella Dadsey and Olive Morris to see what I've been talking about. It also introduced greater specificity in how we are all described, including featuring ethnicity categories on the census for the first time in 1991. Indeed, the term BME came about in the 80s, and the additional A for Asian arose from a shift of self-determination led by the likes of Tariq Moshood, as well as an acknowledgement of the specifically Pan-African roots and the Black Power movement in terms of the concept of political blackness. However, this era, as I said before, also saw the dilution of anti-colonialism and anti-capitalism in favour of seat-at-the-table politics. It was this time in history that changed racial political dynamics in Britain forever. So today, the term is mostly obsolete and is actually quite controversial, although there actually are some younger people who use the term. All right, I think we've reached that point, because do you know what? Why is there all this confusion over the word black? Seriously. How did black even come to be a racial determiner in the first place? I feel like we need to go back to the very beginning, because there actually is a connection. And yes, this is a rabbit hole, and yes, this would not be one of my videos without a rabbit hole. Let me take you to medieval Europe. I know, you've been dying to go. While slavery had existed across humanity for a very long time, at this particular point in history, it actually wasn't much of a thing on the continent, except for the southern Iberian Peninsula, where enslaving European Christians was banned, but enslaving Muslims, Jews, and Slavs was allowed. The practice of slavery and the idea of enslaving specific groups over others was first established in the peninsula during its nearly 800 years as an Islamic society, back when it was known as Al-Andalus. When power switched to Christianity, however, slavery changed drastically, and the Muslims and Jews who weren't driven out or forcibly converted became among the people enslavable. Under Islamic rule, it had been illegal to enslave either group. 1441, 51 years before the last remaining Islamic ruler surrendered Castile, was the year transatlantic slave trade began. From the beginning, the Portuguese and the Spanish did not view African people as fully human, and the first recorded instance of institutionalized racial hierarchy in this era came about after the Pope granted Portuguese King Alfonso V the right to perpetually enslave West Africans and other infidels south of Cape Bojador. This signaled to the rest of Christian Europe that it was open season to enslave and conquer for themselves, and although Europeans had their differences, most of these differences were about power over things like this. They saw each other as more similar than different. They were non-enslavable, racially pure Christians, regardless of whether they were Protestant or Catholic. The dynamic has always been about power, not about whose version of the Bible is less inaccurate. You might have noticed that a notable exception here are the Slavs. So, for the first few centuries of Islamic rule in Iberia, most Slavs actually did not practice Christianity, and a lot of them still practice paganism. So even after Iberia transitioned from Islam to Christianity, the practice of enslaving Slavs was still a thing. So, while negro literally translates to black in Portuguese and Spanish, when used to describe people, it was, from the very start, aimed specifically at Africans and linked to slavery. It was a loaded term, basically. Moro negro was another term that they used in the same way. As other Europeans joined the slave trade, they too adopted negro and its derived terms because of how much they associated the practice of slavery with the Iberians. Take this as an example. When Elizabeth I ordered the deportation of Africans in England, she referred to them as blackamoors and negers, a direct translation of Moro negro and a word clearly derived from negro, respectively. What I'm trying to reiterate here is that black African, and slave were all basically synonyms as far as these people were concerned. The understanding of who Negroes were expanded as Europeans traversed the tropics and considered the people living there in these regions to be enslavable, their lands conquerable. The Spanish and Portuguese started to categorize the type of Negro by specifics, like Negro Terra for indigenous people in the Americas versus Negro Guinea for people brought over from Africa. The British would refer to both the enslaved African and the Bengali peasant as nigger. Iberians were especially concerned with things like classification and using characteristics like skin tone and racial admixture, with this habit deriving from the fact that among themselves they placed great value in so-called racial and religious purity, and being able to prove a pedigree free of Jewish or Moorish ancestry was of the utmost importance to them culturally. Eventually, a common European identity solidified itself along whiteness and Christianity. Think Christendom. To be distinguished as a white European Christian was to be exempt from slavery. So the practice of calling black people black along racial lines always referred to Africans and was also always tied to the enslavement of Africans. It then expanded to include other enslavable or exploitable colonized melanated people across the tropics, but these people usually had other hyphenates to distinguish them from Africans. Africans were also overwhelmingly the sole victims of chattel slavery, making their racialization of blackness unique. While this particular form of racial classification may have been introduced by Christian Iberians, it was quickly adopted and developed further by all Europeans. At some point, direct translations like Schwarz and black emerged, but words derived from Negro, including the N-word itself, continue to be used, an unbroken chain from when Iberians started using the term almost 600 years ago. By the way, I don't know who needs to hear this, but Negro, its descendants are all just straightforward Latin derivatives from Niger or Niger, which means black. It doesn't come from negus. I'm sorry for whoever this is news to. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just telling you. If you want a video that gets into a lot of detail in the history and the different stages of racial classification, as far as Europeans are concerned anyway, check out Little Bill's video, What You Learned About Race is Wrong. Okay, so now we've established that, including the idea that to be non-white was to be treated the same, I now want to explore the historical examples where that was not the case, and where the different races were in fact explicitly treated differently from one another. So let's start in the Victorian Caribbean, where there were tensions between emancipated Africans and Asian indentured labourers. I've already talked about the displays of solidarity, but that wasn't always the case. The Indian community saw dark-skinned people as inferior and saw Africans as polluted. Meanwhile, Christian missionary societies like the Baptist Union spoke of pagans, referring to Muslims and Hindus, and the potential for them to influence the souls of Africans. This had the effect on African opinion to think less of Asians and to argue that they should be treated preferentially due to their closeness to European sensibilities. People thinking that they deserve more rights due to their proximity to Europeanness is a theme. It comes up again. Then you had the fact that the British actively incentivized ex-indentured people to buy crown land in place of a free return to India in order to stay and work in the agriculture sector, creating a land-owning peasantry. This worked. And although Africans benefited from the scheme as well, they were never actively encouraged in the same way, nor offered reparations or acknowledgement of their circumstances at all. Meanwhile, the few Chinese ex-indentured servants who opted to stay in the Caribbean were, along with Chinese entrepreneurs, encouraged by the British government to start businesses during the late 19th century, which was made much easier for them compared to other groups, especially African people. The legacy from this period is still really obvious today. This time in history established them as part of the colonial middle class, alongside the privileged descendants of mixed-race freed people, as well as Jews and Syrians, who at the time each socially considered white and had been there since the days of slavery. This, of course, fueled tensions even further, and there were even instances, unfortunately, of violence. And then you had the scenes in Africa. As Britain expanded during the scramble in the late 19th and early 20th century, they had a mixed approach depending on how established they already were in the region. For example, in places where they already had chartered companies like the African Company of Merchants in West Africa, they transitioned those to crown colonies, like they did when they turned it into the Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana. However, in places where there were no other Europeans laying claim, they simply overthrew whoever was in power. When they ousted Arab rule in East Africa, they established the Imperial British East Africa Company in 1888 to develop and run the new colony. As they established themselves, they encouraged migration from Asia as a way of generating trade, and Asian and European trading posts form alongside one another. Another, much larger wave of Indian migration was comprised of, you guessed it, indentured labourers, this time to work on the Kenya-Uganda railway. The British were particularly fond of doing this because India had a large population even back then, and also due to their familiarity with the British system. There's also the fact that a lot of indentured labourers ultimately came from areas that they'd been displaced from because of British activity in their lands. In total, 32,000 Indian labourers were brought into East Africa during this time. Facing similarly inhumane conditions to those found in the Caribbean plantations, labourers on the railway were dealing with a variety of issues, including but certainly not limited to man-eating lions. Understandably, this made them abandon working for a few weeks because, you know, several men had been killed by these man-eating lions. Finally, the other way Indians ended up in East Africa under the British was via the military, and in the 1890s, they deployed sepoys to the region to enforce colonial rule.
The white men first came from the coast as buyers and dealers. They sold blankets, bracelets, beads and calico sheets, and they bought elephant tusks in return. But they were not fighting. They were accompanied by armed guards, but fought only if provoked. Their main purpose, really, was trade.
Due to their function, they were already treated differently in society, a precursor of the social position they'd eventually come to inhabit. After their contracts lapsed, they were encouraged to settle, with the likes of colonial administrator Sir Harry Johnston viewing them as, quote, agents of change, who'd established the Indian way of doing things. The use of Indian here is of course misleading because when they said Indian, what they really meant is colonial, aka British, the British way of doing things. Because it was cheaper to create Asian settlements compared to European settlements, Indian migration was actively encouraged through colonial policy, and the British utilised them to develop and maintain the agricultural sector. This was mutually beneficial as the Indians soon developed a monopoly. In the meantime, indigenous East Africans had little to no say in colonial policy. There was a clear racial hierarchy in British East Africa. Europeans, the British, held political, institutional and military authority. Africans and Asians were beneath them, but Asians' familiarity with colonial systems compared to Africans proved an asset, rendering them superior to Africans. They'd been around Europeans for longer and were more civilized, aka westernized. Remember what I said earlier about the protestations of Africans in the Caribbean when comparing themselves to the Indians and seeing themselves as more civilized and therefore more deserving because of their proximity to Europeans? Well, here it is in reverse. Africans ended up comprising the exploited peasantry, working in Asian-run industries where the goods were then sold on to European markets. Neighbourhoods were also racially segregated, essentially operating an apartheid system, with European and Asian living quarters far more humane than African slums. Despite all this though, the truth of the matter is, the position Indians had in society was a precarious one, not of their own choosing, and neither Asians nor Africans ever had any political power during British rule. Early political activity among Kenyan Indians, for example, had been mainly among the merchant class who, seeing themselves as sub-imperialists, tried to get elective representation and land access that white people were keeping for themselves. These requests were rejected. However, the rise of nationalism and anti-colonialism in India itself influenced Indians in East Africa, and events like the Amritsar massacre in the Punjab region, whereby hundreds of peaceful anti-colonial protesters were gunned down by the British, ended up shifting a lot of East African Indians towards anti-colonialism. The British then started actively pitting Africans and Indians against one another, telling Africans that Indian immigration created unfair competition and that it was a threat to the empire and to Christianity even. However, you had figures like Harry Thuku, a Kikuyu activist who organised the first African-led political demo in Kenya and from the very beginning collaborated with Indians, which was fairly controversial actually among his fellow Africans. He eventually founded the East African Association, which represented the Kikuyu, the Maasai and the Kamba people, and this group also had very close alliances with Indians as they both had a common oppressor. white settlers. The British reacted by branding him as a puppet for Indian interests, but as far as he and many of his fellow Africans were concerned, the Indians were not the ones who'd forced their way onto their lands, and they could see how both parties were victims of imperialism. This all became very obvious during the 60s and 70s, and you probably had an idea where this was all going to end up, if you're familiar with the history. In 1971, the British government assisted General Idi Amin in overthrowing Milton Obote, who'd failed in his promises to elevate the position of the black Ugandan.
The Asian community, 80,000 out of a population of 10 million, has controlled Uganda's economy. They own nearly all the large shops and businesses. They do all the importing and exporting. They own the factories. They man the skilled posts. They're the doctors, the clerks, the accountants. In the 70 years since Britain brought them into East Africa, they've managed, quite simply, to take over the economy of Uganda. In the poorer, mixed areas of Kampala, the Asians, small shopkeepers and businessmen, are always richer than the Africans. This man is typical of thousands of Asians in Uganda. His business employs 4 Africans and provides him with a comfortable income. It allows him to employ a houseboy, an African. The Africans are the servants in every Asian household. They earn about £2 a week, providing their masters with the good life. The Asian elite live Western, sophisticated lives. They enjoy the recreation of the affluent. They earn £5, £10, £20,000 a year. The golf club, an Imperial legacy, now admits Asians as well as Europeans. The Africans are their caddies. It is a role to which the African has long been accustomed, but it's now an African who's bringing the serene progress of the Asian lives to an abrupt end.
Amin famously ordered all ethnic Indians out of Uganda at a time when their nationality already hung in the balance due to the technicalities around Uganda's status as a colony, as well as the controversial passing of the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which put them at risk of statelessness, something the British were aware of and did anyway. So in this next bit, I actually want to look at the mechanics of divide and rule played out among people of the same race. So let's use Nigeria as an example for this. In 1914, Frederick Lugard amalgamated the North and South Nigeria protectorates under one nation. The East and West regions in the South were then created in 1946. These lines roughly corresponded to where chartered companies like the Royal Niger Company had operated. Indirect rule basically meant that Nigeria had previously been governed by these chartered companies, who did not answer to the crown but had its permission to operate and collect profit by any means necessary, including the use of their own armies. The RNC, for example, created their own constabulary in 1888 to seize control of the hinterlands, committing many atrocities along the way. In the beginning, they preferred to deliberately recruit from the areas specifically outside the hinterlands because they felt that would mean that people would actually enforce things if it was directed towards people who were not their own. But then they eventually transitioned towards a preference for Hausa recruits. Sometimes selectiveness came from whatever was easiest, especially pre-existing structures. For example, Northerners were routinely recruited to the colonial civil service due to there already being a bureaucratic system in place which was established during the Sokoto Caliphate days. At the time of amalgamation, the North was bigger and more populous, while the South had a more diverse and larger economy. The decision to amalgamate was therefore a financial one. The British wanted to pay less tax towards supporting the northern economy and decided that the southern economic surplus could pick this up instead. In fact, revenue sharing across the various economic centres in Nigeria was what made the need for strong regional definitions integral to the creation of one Nigeria. This, combined with existing differences between the North and South, made for strong regional governments and a weak centre. Nigeria was and is home to hundreds of ethnic groups, and the Constitution of 1946 really established factionalism and regionalism as integral to Nigerian politics. All these isms and schisms. Ethnicity was and still is especially important, and the political parties formed along the lines of the largest ethnic groups, the Hausa Fulani, the Igbo, and the Yoruba. In 1953, in a move towards unity, they mutually agreed to a federal constitution, but perversely, this actually led to great attention among them as they each worried that the other would ultimately seek domination. Anyway, in 1958, 2 years before independence from Britain, things got interesting when Shell BP Petroleum Development Company, a British joint petroleum venture, struck oil in Ogoniland, located in the Niger Delta in the East region. Up until that point, regions retained mineral royalties, but upon this discovery, this changed so that regions only kept half for themselves, while the rest was distributed between the federal government and the rest of Nigeria. The three-region model also meant that the big three ethnicities dominated the political sphere. While the oil was discovered in the east, an area where Igbos made up the majority, this particular area was traditionally inhabited by the Ogoni people, one of Nigeria's many ethnic minorities. Despite a coalition government formed between the Igbo and the northern parties after independence elections, tensions came to a head with a coup in the north and a failed one in the southwest, led by Igbo Major Chukwuma Nzogwu.
Major Nzogwu, can you please give me an account of the night of the coup in Kaduna?
We started this off on the night of the 13th of January, when a night exercise was planned by the military college. Next day, we went out again for the same type of exercise, and at the end, we issued them with ammunition this time, live ammunition. Well, no, we didn't see him until the time we actually shot him. Then we went to the rear of the house and started searching from room to room until we found him amongst the women and children, hiding himself. So we sort of took away the women and children and took him.
Now, what are your relations with General Iransi in Lagos?
Well, very good. He's my boss. I have always been under him, and I still am under him.
The casualties were mainly northern politicians and army officers. Nigeria's first post-independence prime minister, Northerner Alhaji Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, was among the dead. As much as this took place after independence from the British, they of course still had lots of power, and protecting their oil interests, mobilized to take over high command, eventually backing another Igbo, General Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi. While he neutralized Nzogwu, he also established the federal regions, angering the north and eventually leading to another coup and his death. This coup also saw thousands of southerners who were based in the north, mostly Igbo, be killed as well. Britain continued to exercise its power, and in a secret High Commission memo from 1966, it reveals that the British wished to maintain control due to Nigeria's potential to become a great power in Africa, which, given the Cold War backdrop, the British did not want to risk. Anyway, a dispute ensued over which government, regional or federal, should receive the royalties, with the British government advising Shell BP to pay the latter. In response to this, on the 30th of May 1967, Igbo military governor Emeka Ojukwu declared the entire East region as the Republic of Biafra.
If civil war comes, and I do think it is imminent, you're quite right. It will for us be the price of freedom. Our people here have for a long time been prepared for this eventuality, and I am confident of their readiness. I think that when it does come, that the people on the other side would be surprised as to what they're going to get. And I'm confident that it will not last long.
The dispute reached a deadlock, the Nigerian government imposed an embargo, and the British took the Nigerian side, while the French, who were set to benefit from Nigeria's disintegration, backed Biafra, supplying them with weapons. Both powers were very underhanded here, with the French in particular denying their involvement throughout the conflict. Anyway, remember the ethnic minorities? Well, the ones in the east weren't all flying under the Biafran banner. I've talked about the dominance of the big three ethnicities, and in 1966, a group of Ijaw youths staged a rebellion of their own against Biafra, declaring themselves the Niger Delta People's Republic. However, this rebellion was summarily crushed. I say all of this to illustrate that the ethnicity dominance was a hangover from the colonial days, and everyone fared worse. I also provide all of this as the context behind the Nigeria-Biafra War, which lasted for 2.5 years from July 1967. Between 1 to 2 million people lost their lives, with the casualties being mainly Igbo people, as well as ethnic minorities. Half of those who lost their lives were children. I use this as an example of how divide and rule played out among black people, but let me be cheeky and quickly mention another example, this time from the British Raj. I know we're not talking about black people here, and it's another rabbit hole, but there's actually a bonus fact in there as well. Plus, it's impossible to talk about divide and rule in the empire without mentioning India. 1600 was the year when it all began for Britain's campaign to eventually rule over India, after Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to the East India Company. At this point, the major power in this region was the Mughal Empire, and the British engaged with them a lot in the beginning, even calling upon them for support against the Portuguese. Remember what I said about Robinson's collaborative theory of imperialism? This is an example of that. Anyway, fast forward 150 years, and the EIC now had substantial territory in the east and in Bombay. Britain's only rivals for power at this point were a few disparate leaders here and there, and the Mughals. You had a constant flow of people from places like Persia, Turkey, and Europe, either as merchants or joining the army alongside Indians. At this time, there were two types of elites: established ones from pre-existing traditions and the newly created merchant class. This is relevant because the British had, for the entire time, but particularly from the mid-1700s onwards, been studying hard, trying really hard to find evidence, any evidence they could, to back up their beliefs around being the spiritual heirs to the Roman Empire, with scholars making much of anything that they could tie to Greek or Roman influence, studying historical migration patterns throughout the ages. Now, why? Why were they doing all of this, you might ask? Well, they were, as I said, trying to find links with the Romans, but also they were trying to undermine any claims that the Islamic Mughals had to rule, making out that it was them who were the actual foreign invaders. Conversely, the British framed their overthrowing of the Mughals as righting a historical wrong. And the Indian Mutiny of 1857 led to the British ousting the last remaining Mughal ruler, Bahadur Shah Savar, marking the end of the 3 centuries-long empire. Soon after this, India was brought under the British crown, ushering in the age of the British Raj. The real reason I took you down this rabbit hole is that while, yes, it provides an example of divide and rule plain as day, because the British colonized Muslims and Hindus alike, and there'd already been an Islamic presence in India for at least 1,000 years, giving them far more legitimacy in the area than the British had. I also want to point out that this period led to the discovery of the Indo-European language family. It's real, and it includes most European languages, including Germanic, Latin and Greek, as well as languages like Sanskrit and Persian/Farsi. And if you like stuff like this, just Google Indo-European words for daughter to see how they're all similar. However, it was also during this time when the theory of white people descending from the Eurasian steppe and the Caucasus emerged, as well as the concept of the Aryan race, the word Aryan coming from the same root as Iran. One rather infamous example of the legacy of this time was the Nazis culturally appropriating imagery from this region, including the swastika, because of these theories. So basically, the British, or Europeans in general at this point, had concocted this sort of origin story that tied them to Indians as a way of legitimizing, ousting other powers. Very complex. I've summarized it and I've left out a load of details, but that was essentially the vibe. And look at how influential that time has been in the understanding of whiteness. What does any of this that I've discussed add up to? Well, I wanted to examine the dynamics of the working classes of all races and those dynamics' imperial origins. I wanted to see what was in this idea of solidarity. What I've described also provides context to the modern day dynamics that we have with one another, one way or another. The working class being racialized as exclusively white and being seen as isolated from everybody else is an idea that still comes up frequently, as was seen a few years ago when Eddie Dempsey made an address at a Brexit rally.
And I tell you, the problem we've got in the left is, as the institutions of the working class and their jobs have been removed from around this country, some of their institutions been taken over by the Liberals. Whatever you think about people that turn out for Tommy Robinson demos or any other march like that, the one thing that unites them people is their hatred of the Liberal left. And they are right to hate them, they are correct. There's too many in the Labour Party right now, they've made a calculation that there's a certain section of the top end of the working class in alliance with people they calculate from ethnic minorities and the Liberals. That's enough to get them into power. And they believe that alliance is all they need, that they can disregard all of the working class people in this country that have been driven away from the Labour movement by the neoliberals.
And before anyone starts, it wasn't just Femi Osori that brought this up. I know people have very mixed feelings towards him, but a lot of black people expressed their concerns, and it was a lot of white people and non-black people who were basically telling black people that they were falling for manipulation. I don't know what it is. Whenever black people bring up stuff, people always accuse us of being manipulated by outside forces. Anyway, a study was done in 2021 looking into working class messaging from both the British left and right wings, and the popular narrative from both pits them as victims of globalization, when what I've laid out shows you some examples of where they've net benefited from globalization throughout history and at the expense of other exploited people. The left and right also lean into the rhetoric that they've been left behind in favour of the supposed middle-class interest in ethnic minorities and other marginalised groups. But yet when it comes to things like union engagement, black people actually make up the highest proportion of union membership, followed by white people. In fact, David Cameron got off extremely lightly that time when he rejected a proposal to finally make socio-economic status a protected characteristic under equalities legislation, which is something that would have made policy around class all the more quantifiable. Speaking of the trade unions, interest has never been more high than in recent years, and while it's heartening to be a part of, the mainstream unions won't face their history, although they are at least a little bit more self-reflecting than the Labour Party, who, speaking of, have just had a series of documentaries released by Al Jazeera exposing a hierarchy of racism, including horrible degrees of anti-blackness, as well as other unethical behaviours.
I faced more racism in my 5 years in the Labour Party than I have in the rest of my life combined.
I'd argue a display of modern-day divide and rule if there ever was one. There were even examples of collusion with the far right, something the Labour Party has a very long history with if you've watched my video on Labour, the Tories and identity politics. In some ways, their ilk have never been a threat to the binary status quo, and the likes of the English Defence League, founded in 2009, are relegated to the fringe. A cobbled-together mass of everything from pro-establishment imperialists to organised crime football firms, the British far right have always lacked cohesion and have to rely on larger parties to keep them sweet in order to maintain a foothold in British politics. However, that reliance isn't without reward. Leader Keir Starmer, of course, has yet to formally acknowledge any of these revelations and probably still expects black people to vote for him when the time comes. The way Labour takes the black vote for granted almost reminds me of the time Joe Biden questioned black people's blackness. Speaking of politicians, the recent Conservative leadership race and subsequent new government under Liz Truss, there's been a wave of articles bemoaning critiques of black Tories, and many seem concerned that we're not all getting behind the most diverse cabinet in history as a win for all BAMEs.
You know, there are elements in our police forces that are held back from doing the things that I think they want to do that would actually keep us safe because of an ideology, right? And we talked about this wokish ideology, and, you know, stop and search is a good example of a technique that works, that police forces are not always using for reasons that are not right. It comes to another thing that we don't tackle, which affects young girls. That's the issue of grooming gangs, which I've been very clear that we must tackle, and we all know why we don't talk about it. It's not right.
Rishi's not going to win it. Rishi's not even British, in most people's opinion. He doesn't love England like Boris does.
He himself is a British citizen, isn't he?
OK, lots of people are. Half of Al-Qaeda are British citizens.
Because, you know, isn't it all about POC solidarity, guys?
If your mum was sent back because her documents, she couldn't provide them because they've been deleted, what would you have to say? I think you'd be standing in a different position right now.
I'd be appalled at that, but we don't
Appalled?
actually...
Even when the POC in question are all too happy in harming other POC?
I would love to be having a front page of the Telegraph with a plane taking off to Rwanda. That's my dream. That's my dream. It's
when
my
will that
obsession.
happen?
And then, every few weeks, it seems like there's another high-profile example of someone overstepping a boundary because of this BAME over-familiarity, like what happened recently with Charlie Brooker's sister-in-law, West London Labour MP Rupa Huq, who was basically challenging Kwesi Kwarteng's blackness the other day, owing to his distinct lack of street credentials, I guess.
No, I'm sorry if I was not making myself understood clearly. He's superficially, he's a black man, but again, he's got more in common. If you look at again, it's that Joe Cox thing, more in common. If you look at the character, he went to Eton, I think he went to very expensive prep school, all the way through the top schools in the country. If you hear him on the Today programme, you wouldn't know he's black.
I mean, he's a horrendous politician, but that doesn't undo his blackness, although it will not be me who starts defending the guy and his colonial intermediary self. No. They're both trash. I'm not exerting my energy. But no wonder Brooker hasn't released a new Black Mirror in the UK for so long, because the truth has been stranger than fiction in this place for a very, very long time, and we're all suffering. Please send help.
It is total, absolute, abject chaos.
So I took ages writing this, partly because life, And partly because I kept picking it up again and then putting it down and thinking at one point, is it me? Am I the bad vibes? Am I the divisive one? Especially during recent weeks, and when there's definitely been solidarity and all of us joining hands to collectively not mourn Lizzie. And roasting the ever-living daylights out of the literal great unwashed who queued for the best part of an entire day.
Many are making this pilgrimage for their loved ones. And when that opportunity looks like it's slipping away, frustration comes to the fore.
Sit on the line. They should have known.
Crowds were temporarily halted for safety.
This will be open. I'm not sure about that. Open it.
But then I was like, nah, do it. Do the video. Discussing history is not bad vibes. Ultimately, this video is to demonstrate that running away from history or refusing to acknowledge it actually deepens division and resentment. Noticing anti-blackness from other communities, sometimes even coming from someone who just told you that they identify as politically black, is not divisive. The anti-blackness is. And the lack of safety within so-called political blackness is. In fact, I actually have my own personal stories about people who had literally just identified as politically black, only to then operate in bad faith, sometimes in spaces specifically set up for race equality. Being wary of traditionally white working class organisations with their extensive histories of propping up or investing in imperial dynamics is not divisive. Imperialism and racism is. According to many, to have solidarity is to turn a blind eye and, quote, move on without resolution. And if you insist, then you'll be accused of being the reason why the unions can't succeed or why the left can't unite in this country. Okay, yes, we are the ones who are creating all the problems, yes. But also, the actual historical examples of strength and solidarity are not covered in the curriculum or mainstream political discourse. We need to be taking inspiration from the past in order to help us forward in the future. We need to confront our dynamics in order to move forward in truth. Alright, so pay no mind to the fact that I've released this during Black History Month. This is really important for me to say. I'm behind schedule. This is not a Black History Month video. I do kind of feel like my entire channel is a testament to Black British history, and I'm aware that the subject matter meant that I kind of had to talk about everybody, which is a problem when it comes to Black History Month in this country, where sometimes it's treated like it's everybody's month when it's supposed to celebrate African heritage people specifically. So I don't want to add to that with this video. I don't know why I'm being so on top of my disclaimers today, but I think it's because literally the subject matter of this video is actually like part of the issue when it comes to Black History Month. So this is not a Black History Month video. This is just an October video. That said, I do hope that you got something out of this video. And if there's something that you learned or if there's something that resonated, please do leave a comment. With all that, thank you so much for watching.